He would be sharing the screen.
Yeah, shall I
You,
go ahead and
Jake.
share my screen?
Yep, go for it.
Excellent. All right, Nabila, do you want to say anything before we kick off, or should we just dive into it?
No, I don't really have anything. I think we can just start with the introductions. I'm Nabila Jaffer, Program Manager for Strategic Projects. And on to you, Jake.
Great, thanks. So I'm Jake Carlson. I'm the Director of Deep Blue Repositories and Research Data Services, just sort of rolls off the tongue. And I'm really pleased to be here with you talking about the work we've done with Samvera and to make it into a data repository that provides the functionality we need to offer our services. So this, I think, is really meant to be an informal presentation. If you have questions or things that you want me to go into more detail about, I'm happy to do so. I've got a couple of slides to sort of go through first to introduce you to the services and the kinds of things we've done with Deep Blue data using Samvera, and then a brief demonstration of the kind of things that we do and how we use the platform. And there again, if there are particular things that you want to see or things that you want to talk about, please just jump right in. So let's see. Great. So just a little bit about who we are. I've introduced myself. I have a colleague of three who provide the services for the department. We, as a department, oversee two repositories: Deep Blue, which has been around since 2006, and that's mostly for human readable materials, so your articles, your presentations, images, things like that. And then Deep Blue Data, which came along in 2016. And we are really fortunate to have a team of very able developers to support us with all the things that we need really to develop and to make the platforms provide the kinds of services and functionality that we really need. So Nabila, I think you all know. We also have Fritz Freeheit, who is primarily the developer on Deep Blue Data, Jose Blanco, who's primarily the developer on Deep Blue Docs. I should mention that Deep Blue Docs, yeah, it's on the slide. Deep Blue Docs is on DSpace, and Deep Blue Data is on Hyrax. So we are running two different platforms. And then Noah Botmer, our solutions architect. So a little bit about what we do. I think the one of the main things that we do with our repositories is to provide a means to enable people who have published their research to make it openly accessible to the world. So on the screen, there's an image of a journal article written by Terry Ruiz, who is a graduate student at Dearborn, about his work in developing algorithms to detect plagiarism in documents, particularly that plagiarism that's been generated by a machine. How can you tell, whether or not the article you're looking at has actually been plagiarized? And so this is a particularly interesting article, particularly if that's your field. But if you want it and you don't have a subscription to it, you've got to pay $30 to get access to the article. But Terry has deposited his article into Deep Blue, which is openly available to anybody in the world who's interested in coming to find it. So that's one of the things we do, is to support open access using Deep Blue documents. The other thing that we do is to publish content of scholarly or educational value that does not have a traditional path for publication. And research data is sort of first and foremost in our minds, but that's true for things like posters given at conferences. If there's no proceedings, we'll publish the poster through their repository as well. So in this case, what you're seeing here is Terry's data set that goes behind the article that you saw previously, available in Deep Blue. And we've linked the two so that if you find the data set seen here, that you can go to the paper, and similarly, if you find the paper in Deep Blue, you'll be directed to the data set. We also produce DOIs, the digital object identifiers, which serve as a permanent identifier, so that if the author chooses, and we certainly highly recommend and encourage them to do so, they can put a link to the data in the article itself, and then people who are clicking on that DOI or following that DOI in the article will be directed to Deep Blue Data to find the data set that lie underneath the article. So that in a nutshell is sort of what we do at a 50,000 foot level. But sharing data is particularly complicated. As I mentioned, there's no sort of natural path for publication for data. And in fact, many folks publishing their data is a new experience, and they haven't really thought much about, well, what would it take to publish data? And data can be complex and messy. There sometimes aren't structures for people to really adhere to, or those structures are unknown to folks. So what we do is not just provide a repository for people to use to share their data, but to provide the services to help them think about how they might share the data and how they might prepare their data for sharing, for use and consumption by people outside of the research project in which the data were generated in. And this requires a bit of investment and time and attention over the course of the data lifecycle. What we try to do is to work with folks not just at the very end when they're ready to share the data or they have to share their data, but to try to help them think about and process and take steps to make the data usable by somebody else as they go through the data lifecycle. And so just to sort of illustrate that in a graphic, data aren't born fully formed. There's an idea, there's a proposal that goes into place usually for money to support the research. The project gets started up, the data are collected, they're then processed or worked into a way where they can be analyzed. And then the extractions of the data that demonstrate the findings are translated into tables or graphs or other kinds of things that can be consumed. And so all along that particular process, we offer services to help people really think about their data as a publishable object or as a scholarly object of value. So we help them with their data management plan to think about what they might want to do and when they might want to do it during the data lifecycle. We help them think about what metadata or documentation they might need to make this something that somebody else could use and to find value in. We help them organize and structure their data, again, to encourage its use. And we help them think about a repository that's appropriate for their data set. So it's not just solely focused on Deep Blue data, although that's the repository we run. If there's a repository out there that serves a particular domain, and one example is ICPSR, which is also located at the University of Michigan campus, they focus explicitly on social science data. So they have a number of experts who really work very closely in the social sciences and can prepare and curate that data set to have increased value when it's published. We don't have anything like that. We are a institutional repository, and so we are broad rather than deep. So we provide support for researchers at the University of Michigan in the 19 different colleges and umpteen different departments that we have. So we see a lot of different types of data come through, and we host a lot of different types of data in Deep Blue data. So, but if they do choose to use the Deep Blues, we then sort of work with them through the deposit workflow. And so the next stage of our workflow is the researcher has deposited something to either Deep Blue Docs or Deep Blue data. And both steps to do so are listed here. You see they're fairly similar. We're asking for context about the deposit, so information about who wrote it, what's the title, what's the subject. We ask them to upload the files, obviously, because without the files, we're not hosting anything, and so there's nothing really to talk about there. Deep Blue Docs has an extra step for a license. It's because sometimes the depositor may not have the authority to issue a license if they're in fact, taking a preprint or something that they've given copyright to the publisher. They don't have the authority to assign a license locally here, and so that's an optional step with Deep Blue Docs. It's a mandatory step with Deep Blue data, and so we've incorporated that into our metadata step. They're asked to agree to our terms of use that sort of spell out, what they're agreeing to give us and what rights they're surrendering, as well as, what they're allowed to do. So just figuring out, again, to be sure that they understand what it is that they're agreeing to, and then if it's put into Deep Blue documents, the published content goes live. We don't have we may get something that goes through the Deep Blue documents process and not know that we get it. It's an unmediated deposit process, and a DOI and handle is minted at that particular stage. At the point where they've agreed to the terms of use, if they're depositing a data set, the data set does not go live. We go through, we review every single data set that we receive in Deep Blue data to look at, are there things we can do to enhance the value of that data set for others to use. Again, because data don't necessarily have a natural publication workflow, we want to be sure that the data set is complete and as robust as possible. And so once the depositor clicks on submitting the data set, it goes to a space where it's in sort of a holding an area for us to take a look at. And we do an initial review of every data set that we get. We look at, is this actually a data set? Is there actually documentation attached to this data set? If there's not, we sort of stop the show right there and ask for a README file or whatever documentation is appropriate. We look for things like, are there sensitive data attached to this, or is this a sensitive data set? And we are not equipped to take data that has not been de-identified or not that shares human subject information or other sensitive topics. That's just beyond our capabilities. So then we also decide, okay, is this something that we want to review locally, or is this something we want to send off to an organization called the Data Curation Network? The Data Curation Network has been in operation now for, I think, 2 years or so. This is a network of universities that also run data curation services, much in the same way that University of Michigan does, as a means to sort of expand the pool of expertise that we have available to us in curating and reviewing the data. So it may be that we get a data set deposited to Michigan, but we know there's somebody at the University of Minnesota, a Data Curation Network member, who has expertise in the type or the format of the data that we just received. We can send that data set to the University of Minnesota to do the curation review, and thus with their additional expertise to do perhaps a more thorough job or a more centered job for that particular community than we would be able to do at Michigan. And similarly, we offer the same service at Michigan. So we have some expertise in, say, NetCDF files, which are used by climate scientists. We may get some NetCDF files coming to us from the University of Minnesota when they receive them as deposit. It's also a nice way for us because we're never quite sure what we're going to get and when we're going to get it. If we are slammed, if we get a lot of deposits at once, this is sort of a pressure release valve for us that we can send a data set off to one of our Data Curation Network members for their review and their curation expertise. So wherever we send it, the process is pretty similar. There are 3 broad categories of things we look for in a data set. First, we look at the data themselves. So how are the data structured? How are they organized? Are there missing variables? Are there outliers that perhaps raise some questions? So we look at the data. We then look at the documentation. So is the documentation complete? Is there a sense as to how the data was generated or limitations on its use, particular software that's required and such? Do we have an inventory of the files and what the files contain? And then finally, we look at the connections between the data files. So a data set is more than just one file. It's at very minimum the data itself and the README or the documentation file. But oftentimes data consists of tens of files, of hundreds of files, even thousands of files and more. And so we want to be sure that the files and how they're named or how they're grouped or how they're organized form a cohesive data set, that you can see what this group of files has to do with this group of files, that there's sort of an obvious connection and relation there. Once we do all that work, we draft a set of recommendations, or we have a set of recommendations sent to us from the Data Curation Network, and we enter the negotiation phase with the depositor. So we will say, thank you, Dr. Smith or whoever, for submitting your data set. We have the following recommendations for you. Can you work with us to either make these changes to the data set or to give us permission to make these changes on your behalf, if that's something that we can do? So the negotiation process goes back and forth. Once those changes have been made or have been made to the fullest extent that the depositor is willing to permit, we then go ahead and mint a DOI and publish a data set. We can mint a DOI earlier in the process. As I said, we really want people to try to cite this data and treat it as an object of scholarship in and of itself. And so if needed or desired, we will mint a DOI earlier as long as we have the files. There's usually a process of change through the negotiation process, so things will be updated or switched around. But as long as we know that the deposit, or have a pretty good sense the deposit will be fulfilled and we will publish this, we'll mint a DOI earlier so that it can be used to cite the data in the article and point people to the data set as it exists in Deep Blue Data. So that's sort of the overall curation process that we use. This is what our repository looks like in terms of displaying the data sets. I just wanted to sort of talk a little bit about the number of data sets we have. We've been around, we launched in September of 2016. This actually is a little bit out of date, even as last week. We now have 407 data sets in Deep Blue Data. And perhaps more importantly, if you look over to the side, we have a wide variety of different types of data sets. So I think data sharing is particularly pertinent in the sciences and in the tech fields and the STEM fields, because they're being asked to do so or required to do so as part of their funding or as part of their publications. And so we would expect to see a lot of science data sets and a lot of engineering data sets. We also have done fairly well with the humanities and even the social sciences to an extent too, although we do have ICPSR on campus, as I mentioned. I will confess that the humanities is mostly because of one particular depositor, but I think we are starting to see the idea that data ought to be shared as a normative part of scholarship really taking root across the different disciplines. There are a number of features that we developed as a part of just showing up and enabling the repository to function as a data repository in the ways that we need it. The administrative functionality that we have a little bit of a different administrative process than I think most repositories using Samvera do. And so Nabila and her team really have done a lot of work to enable us to create a holding space and to create the kind of space where we can review and develop and work on the data sets prior to publication. We have a number of additional metadata fields. So we do ask for the sort of the standard stuff to enable people to cite the data set, the title, the authors, et cetera. But you also want to know what the methodology was behind the data set, not just what the data set is, but how did it come to be. We really view the metadata as a means to help people find the different data sets that we have, but also to understand them well enough to say, yes, this is something I do want to download, or actually, this isn't quite what I'm looking for. I'm going to move on. So we try to really think about what people might be looking for and to provide that information as a part of the metadata. We have a number of data sets, as you might imagine, that are quite large. Data, particularly in the sciences and engineering, really can get quite large quite quickly. And so we had to accommodate that as a means of providing our services. Globus is a system that I would describe it sort of as an FTP on steroids. So it's not that the download will go faster, but the download is more secure and more stable. So it may still take a couple of hours to download a particularly large data set, but if you walk away from your computer, if you turn it off, when you come back again and restart it, that connection starts up again and the download continues. You haven't broken anything. So that's been a tremendously helpful tool to have to enable us to serve out large data sets without really slowing down the system or breaking the connection. We have the single use feature. We've just recently sort of modified that to enable us to allow peer review of the data. So oftentimes a data set will be submitted as part of a publication, and the journal or will want to enable peer review, not just of the article, but of the data set itself. And that's been a challenge for us because up until fairly recently, we had to publish the data set so people could look at it and then unpublish it or step back from it, which is far from ideal. So we've enabled the single use feature to produce a URL that will work one time to let people who are going to review the data set into our holding area to grab a hold of it and to grab it and to make their review and to get back to folks. So we've been able to do that now without having to publish the data set, which is nice. We're building our capabilities with regards to APIs. One of our, I think, strategic goals is not just to be a box where people put things in or take stuff out of, but to be a node on a network. And in order to do that, we have to enable people to be able to interact with content, either depositing or coming to get it, outside of the means of just using the user interface. And so the developing a REST API capability is a step towards achieving that particular goal of being a node on a much larger set of networks. And then we've worked pretty hard to develop some local analytics. So really trying to figure out how can we determine views and downloads and display and convey that information to people who have deposited data with us? And just like articles and just like other materials, people want to know who's or how much interaction people are having with their data set. And so we're developing that capability to really measure that and to measure that in a standardized way. So Deep Blue Documents has a connection with a group called IRAS, which is in the UK, and they're really looking at how can we come up with or apply sort of a standardized set of definitions for what a view actually means or what a download actually means to enable us to not only share that information with users with a degree of confidence, but also to be able to benchmark repositories in terms of the number of downloads and the number of views. So we've been working on, we have that connection now for Deep Blue Documents. We're working on developing that connection for Deep Blue Data as well. And that brings us to the demo time, although I see there's some chat questions, so apologies. I was talking and I missed them. Let's see, so I think we have one question. Do we have plans to contribute back to local analytics? Yeah, I would say yes. I think, and Nabila, you can correct me if I'm wrong, we do make all of our code publicly accessible through our Git installation.
Yeah, that's right. And the local analytics we have so far, we have enabled it only for the admins, because we are also in the process of confirming that they are really good and there are no bots analytics in there, like removing the bots and all those things. So we have it on our GitHub, and I think Fritz also wrote a blog about it, so I can share that again. Yeah. And about the iris, that is something we are planning to work with JISC. So that would be, anyways, open source iris gem. So that would be different. Yep.
Okay, and then Robin asked a question of what does DBIRD stand for, and where does the team report? Yeah, so DBIRDs, it's the acronym. It's a lot easier to say than Deep Blue Repository and Research Data Services. It sort of stops up there. So DBIRDs is a way to sort of shorten that. And we are actually a part of the publishing unit of the library. So Michigan Publishing is under the library. These are the folks who publish books and have published books on a regular basis. But they also offer what are called Michigan Publishing Services. So things that perhaps have scholarly value or educational value, but aren't quite suited for commercial book purposes. Our publishing services unit will work with those folks to produce something that's published that meets their needs. And then we're sort of the third pillar of publishing services as the repository services unit. So we take things that either have already been published or who don't have sort of a natural track for publication, and we use our institutional repositories to enable open access to those materials. And let's see, other questions. Yeah, so Franny mentioned that we've had some conversations about analytics. Yep, and my hope is that those will continue. Any other thoughts or questions before we go on with the demo? Okay, I will go ahead and open up Deep Blue Data. This is the front page of Deep Blue Data. So I will show you first sort of what our works look like. I'm just going to go ahead and click on Browse, and that pulls up, oh, now we're up to 408, up to 408 data sets. And just to give you a sense of what they look like, we have both works, so the individual data sets that you can see here, as well as collections. I'm going to go ahead and just scroll down to this particular work just to show you a little bit about what it is. So here is the record. So the metadata, as I mentioned, there's a methodology field. You want to know how the data set was created, as well as what the data set is all about. The creator, the depositor, the contact information. This we think is pretty important. If people do have questions about the data set, as they often do, they need to have a way to get in touch with somebody who can answer those questions. And so including the contact information is pretty important. Funding information is another sort of metadata field that we answered. Oftentimes data are shared because of a funding agency requirement, and so we want to enable people to sort of close that loop and to point the funding agency to where the data live and to give them proper credit. The DOI, as I mentioned, is right down there. And then once you get past the records, you get down to the files themselves. And you can see them here. You'll notice that there is a README file at the top of this particular data set, absolutely critically important. It is very, very rare that we will publish a data set without documentation. It really needs that context for people to understand what is it they're looking at and what the value or the impact of the data really are all about. One really nice feature that we didn't cover in terms of the additions is the ability, if the README file is in text, we can enable it to be shown in the record itself. So this gives some people some additional information about the data set before they make the decision as to whether or not to download it. And then down here, we have the option of either, if you click on the file, you'll download an individual file. You can download the entire data set through the download zip dataset button, or you can use Globus to do it. And we generally recommend that people, if it's under 3 gigs, to use just the download zip dataset, to use Deep Blue Data's interface itself. If it's more than 3 gigs, that's when things start to really slow down and get a little cumbersome. They need to send it to Globus to download. And in cases where we have large data sets that are more than 3 gigs, we don't even show the first option. All we show is the send to Globus to download button, just because we don't want people getting frustrated or stuck with things that aren't going to work out for them.
Yeah. One more thing I want to add here, Jake, is like if the data set is already downloaded on Globus, then this button, the text of the button changes to, instead of saying send to Globus, it will say view on Globus because it stays on Globus.
Yeah, and I think we have an example of that, if I remember from my poking around. I think it's this one. Yeah, so in this case, somebody has already sent the data to Globus, and so the way Globus works is that you send it to sort of a staging area, and then Globus picks it up and starts the process. So what this is telling you here, download data from Globus, is that somebody's already done this. We don't wipe out that staging area immediately, unless we need to. So this data set is already ready to go to download from Globus. You don't have to complete that particular part of getting it set up to the staging area. We do have instructions in more about Globus for people who haven't used it before to make it all work. Let's see.
Jake, there are two questions in the chat. Do you want to handle those now?
Sure, yeah. So can users reorder the files in the record to have the README at the top? Yes, though that has been a particularly buggy piece of Samvera that we've had to wrestle with and sort of bang into shape. We think we have it now, and really we find that we as the admin usually are the ones to do that rather than the users, but there is that capability when they're depositing. I can show you that when we look at the deposit screen. And then with the contact metadata, do we have plans for long-term access when a researcher leaves the university? Oof, I wish. We rely on the researcher to tell us if that contact has changed. That hasn't happened yet, though we've only been around for a little more than 4 years. So I would very much love to be able to do that or have a means to do that, but there isn't kind of that automatic alert or kick in. So we don't, and we recognize that that's potentially a problem. Let's see, and then John's asked, do we have use cases or user interest in using Globus to upload ingest? Yeah, we have used Globus to upload and ingest content into Deep Blue Data. We have a couple different ways to do that. Globus is one of them. So if people are interested in using Globus to do that, we can. We also have some other ways within the university to make that happen. So that is an option. Okay.
Yeah, the upload using Globus is still going through the dbirds. It's not really an option right away that you would see on the UI. So if someone contacts dbirds, then we can just give them a direct link to upload to Globus, and then we can just ingest from Globus to Deep Blue Data.
Yeah, it really depends on what makes sense for the researcher and what best suits their needs. So we wanted to give people a couple different options for that. Okay, I'm going to leap back to our homepage. So the next sort of stop on the demonstration is the deposit your work. And you can see, or you will see, oh, no, okay. So if I had been a normal user, it would have asked me for my login credentials. I guess it had enough information about me that it booted me right in. So this is what it looks like for me as the administrator. It would not look like this for anybody else, simply because they won't have administrative privileges. So as administrator, I would go to add new work. And this is what this is the screen that people will be taken to if they clicked on deposit your work. And so we start off again with asking for metadata, for information about the data deposit, and we provide a little bit of information with regards to what we're actually asking for. We do have a screen that provides more details as to each of these particular metadata fields as to what we're looking for, and we'll catch things as well in the review process. Metadata is one of the things that we try to review and try to help people craft metadata that's effective for discovery and for understanding purposes. So we ask people to fill in the metadata, to select a particular license. We found we tried to keep the licensing as relatively simple and straightforward as possible, but there are situations in which people need other licenses, and so we have the ability for people to add a different license and to include that information in the deposit. We will review that as part of the review process to be sure that it is not it doesn't go too far against what we were hoping to accomplish with being an open data repository, that it doesn't limit use or limit openness too much. Let's see. Yeah, and then we have space here to add curation notes. So if, for example, back to the earlier situation where we had to publish a data set and then unpublish it, make changes, and republish it, again, we try very hard not to do that. But if we did have to do that, there's a space here we can add some curation notes to describe, well, on this date, we made these changes for this particular reason. And then we also have some curation notes for us as admin that would not be publicly displayed, just for provenance and for management purposes. Once the person goes through and fills out the description, they'll be taken to the files. You might have seen the buttons that add files at the very bottom. This is where they would upload their work, and they can do so either through browsing on their computer or by dragging and dropping the files there. And that's pretty much it as far as the user is concerned. We do have some other functionality here that enables us to assign a data set to a particular collection. Oh, I didn't show you that. I'll have to show you that later on. So we use the collection function not as sort of the basic structure of the repository as we do for Deep Blue Docs. You're not depositing into a particular collection with data unless you set one up. We found that data, there's often a hierarchical nature to data, and Samvera unfortunately can't really represent that very well. You can't upload a natural folder into Samvera and to have that hierarchy reproduced. So a collection is one way to kind of fake around that hierarchy. If you need a central location for multiple data sets, the collection feature will provide that. Yeah, so then once they have the description and the files, they'll need to click on they've read and agreed to the deposit agreement. Hopefully they actually have. And then if they save the work, that kicks off the alert to us and to put the data set in the holding area for us to review. So let me jump back and show you a little bit about the collection. So here's an example of the collection. If we click here, we're able to give some additional description about the data sets within this collection to provide some context as to what is it you're looking at here. And then if you scroll down, there are the 6 data sets that are part of this particular collection. Now I'm logged in right now as an admin, so I can see everything. These 3 data sets that are listed as embargo, they also have not been published yet, so they will not appear on the public view of this particular collection. But they're primed. We're pretty close to publishing them. We'll have an embargo in place for them as well, so they won't actually get access to the data sets until that embargo expires. Right now, you're just going to see the 3 data sets that are published and out of embargo on the public view of this. And again, you can click here and be taken to that particular work, and it looks pretty much like any other work does. Okay, so that's I think that's the end of my nickel tour. Are there other things that people would like to see or chat about? Let's see, there's 2 in the chat. Okay, yeah, it looks like Notch8 is currently implementing Globus. That's great. We've gotten a lot of really good feedback from users and a lot of interest from other repositories in our instantiating Globus as part of the platform. So yeah, thanks. I appreciate the upgrade from nickel to quarter.
That was so cool. Thank you so much, Jake and Nabila, for walking us through.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah, it was really nice of Jake to come and show it as a service perspective, because you all have heard a lot from me in the past, Samvera Connects. So this time I was like, Jake, it would be really nice if you can actually show how you are using it, because when we develop it, it's a different perspective. So yeah, thank you, Jake.
Yeah, my pleasure.